Dr. Andresen, you're going to tell us it's going to be warm, right?
I wish we could say that it would be warm, but just thinking here of a title here today, the appropriate one would really be Arctic Invasion. As you've probably most are aware, we have some very, very unusual weather to deal with, and we have really for the last couple of weeks, but even more abnormal weather here for the next several days. My image here on the cover is a forecast of temperature departures on Saturday morning, and that probably will be the coldest day for most of the state. But what you see here are surface temperatures relative to normal, and the blues and the pinks here are, in some cases, 25 degrees, 30 degrees almost Fahrenheit below normal. Remember, for a lot of the state right now, our average high temperature should be, well, certainly into the 60s, upper 50s in the north, but definitely much, much warmer than what we're dealing with. And on tomorrow, Friday, and on Saturday, some cases, we're going to be lucky to get our temperatures out of the 30s. So a very, very unusual air mass. And you can see that here illustrated looking at North America. A couple of things. This air mass actually originated in the Arctic. It came through Canada, but it actually came from the close to the pole, which we typically don't see. And here by Saturday, you can see it basically moves southward out of the Arctic through Canada. It's on its way right now, and will be here later tonight and tomorrow. But you can see it makes it all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. You can see the leading edge of the colder air and off the southeast coast. That's just something we don't see meteorologically during the month of May. That's what you would see in the middle of the winter. So it's a very, very unusual air mass. And we have the potential, unfortunately, to set some records, not good records, in terms of freezing temperatures. And now I'll talk more about that in just a second. Looking in the rearview mirror here behind the last week, even though we did have, in much of the state, we had some very, very nice seasonable weather last weekend with temperatures in some cases above 70. That was a nice change of pace. Given the cooler than normal nights and in the last couple of days, you can see that we still averaged out near to a couple degrees below normal. So there was a little bit above and below the normals, but overall we did come out cooler than normal. Just as importantly, another story here, precip and moisture on the right. These are weekly precipitation totals. High variability across the state, and we had that really slow-moving area of low pressure move through at the end of last week. And so depending on what part of the state you were at, you either had less than 1/4 of an inch, and that was true down in the southeastern part of the state. Contrast that with very, very heavy rains from west central up through the northern lower into the eastern UP. Some cases more than 4 inches of rain. So a wide variety of conditions. And given that we had a wet, certainly a very wet fall and a wet early winter, and I'm thinking back about some of Kurt's comments here about the overwintering precipitation, we brought soils back up to saturation again, certainly in western and some northern parts of the state. But in contrast, in other portions, the eastern portion of the state, it's been relatively dry, and actually has been dry there for several consecutive weeks. So quite a bit of variability depending on where you are across the state with respect to moisture. With the cooler than normal temperatures of the last several weeks, this is no surprise at all. But in terms of our degree day accumulations going back to the beginning of March, and I'm thinking here of it would be our overwintering crops. We're significantly behind where we typically are. That's not a surprise at all. 1 to as much as 2 calendar weeks, if you think of it in those terms here for this part of the year. But and given the forecast, it's going to look very, very similar again here next week. But still, we are significantly behind where we typically are at this point of the year. Soil temperatures are up, flirting with, again, the threshold that Kurt talked about, around 50 degrees. These are bare soil 2-inch mean temperatures, so it's the average of the max and mins. And in Michigan, generally ranging from the upper 40s in the north to the low 50s. So we're right about, again, right around that 50-degree mark, but they have fallen back from where they were earlier, a little bit cooler than they were. And given the outlook this week, they'll remain there, or maybe even cool down a couple more degrees probably before ultimately, again, the season says they have to warm up, but it's not going to occur anytime soon given the outlook. Well, let's look ahead here at the outlook, and at the beginning of my title slide, you looked at Saturday and that big Arctic air mass. On the map here, it's just off up in northern Manitoba. At the center of this, you can see the isobars up there. It's just off the map a little bit, but it's going to make its way again southward into the lower 48. We have the passage of one cold front. There's actually going to be two. And the first one comes through here during the day-to-day. It will set off a couple, it's going to be either sprinkles or some flurries in the north. It's still cold enough aloft. This is not really the really cold air. That comes tomorrow, but there's two frontal boundaries that do come through. This system has the air with this system. Another thing about it, very important, it's very dry. If you look at the dew point temperatures, especially here later in the day, they're down in the upper teens. Just again, air from the Arctic, it has little moisture to begin with, and it's not going to gain anything on its way down. So low daytime relative humidities, and there's just not much moisture for any precipitation. So anything that does fall, and it will continue into tomorrow as well, we will have a threat of some continuing showers, but a couple hundredths of an inch at best, mostly just trace amounts. And again, by tomorrow, most of it across the state will fall in the form of snow because of the cold temperatures aloft. So moving into tomorrow, the one frontal boundary moves off to our south and east. You can see all of the storm track and all of the major precipitation remains south of Michigan. That's going to be the case here for much of the next week with a drier than normal week. This little trough here you see indicated here through, that's really the leading edge of the really cold air. It's just to the north that you can see the air mass itself is sinking down now, making it into the northern Great Plains and so forth, and then that will spread over towards us by Saturday morning. And again, that's probably the peak of the cold air. So we're setting ourselves up for a very, very unusually cold or cool, and then drier than normal week. Precipitation, I mentioned a little bit here later today and tomorrow. Saturday should be dry and cold. And then another chance, this weather system that's up here in Alberta, you see, that will be moving by on Sunday or later on Sunday, possibly into Monday. Either some cold rain with that or some snow would be the next chance. But like the precip here over the next 24 to 36 hours, if it does fall, it'll be trace or a couple hundredths of an inch. So drier than normal statewide. I think that's a really, really strong bet. In terms of how cold will it get, and I've got three panels on here. These are the current thinking for minimum temperatures here overnight tonight. That's on the left. So Friday morning left, Saturday morning in the center, and then Sunday morning or on the far right here. This is what the current thinking is, and you can see it depends on where you are. Interior areas of the state is almost as often or almost always the case will be a few degrees colder than the areas near the lake. The other thing to note about this outbreak is that it's not going to be a classic springtime radiation type cooling event or freeze event where things go still and we lose all of our clouds and the wind dies down and we see the landscape play major roles here. There's still going to be some wind and breeze. Along those lines, it will be very windy the next couple of days, especially during the daytime. We will see some reduction at night, but still with that wind, it keeps things stirred up just a little bit. There also will be some clouds. It's cold. The air coming over is cold enough to actually cause a little bit of lake effect, depending on where you are in the state. Just things we rarely ever see during the month of May, but we have with this particular situation. You can see temperatures here as low as maybe the low 20s. Given how dry the air is, there may be some areas and some pockets where we do actually see relatively clear and calm conditions. I wouldn't be surprised even to see some upper teens. The positive thing I guess, if anything to say about this is it's been so cool. Most of our crops are well behind normal phenologically where they typically are. There's just much less out there to be vulnerable. Sugar beets might be an exception to that, had been planted earlier, but fortunately we don't have as many crops out and vulnerable. That is not true or not the same as we go south from here, and I would expect to see freezing temperatures significantly south of Michigan, probably down to the Ohio Valley and over portions of the central Corn Belt as well, associated with the same weather feature. But overall here, as we look at the next couple nights, it does look like overnight Friday and Saturday for much of the state, especially central and southern sections, that will be the coldest readings. And again, we could see some mid-20s, which will be at or near record for the date. We even have, actually, there's a chance we could set some all-time records for the month of May, not just for the date. It's just, again, a very, very unusual situation meteorologically and climatology to have an air mass this cold this late. In terms of precip, I mentioned drier than normal. These are forecast totals here for the next week up through, it's actually through next Thursday morning, sorry about that. But it actually has here a half of an inch or a quarter of an inch possible down in the southwest corner. Most of this indicated here would be that precip with the next system coming on Sunday into Monday. I think it's pretty generous. And if I were to put the numbers on here, I think most of the state's going to end up with less than 1/10 of an inch easily. Again, definitely a dry week but moving on here ahead, most of the medium range forecast guides, of course, this question continues. How long can this upper air pattern with this big trough over eastern North America continue? It's been here for at least 3 weeks. And the forecast guidance suggests it's going to be here at least another week, but I guess the caveat is here, it's showing some signs, at least the guidance is saying, of relaxing a little bit. The major north to south amplitude of these features is less in the outlooks now as we move, especially into that third week of May, than it was before. And so while we still have a forecast here, the upper right, or mean temperatures here for our 8 to 14 day outlook, 6 to 10 days very, very similar in terms of temperature. It's also below normal. It's less widespread and it's less in terms of magnitude. So I think what we're looking at is maybe a gradual moderation in temperatures, especially moving. We'll even see some improvement by late next week, I think, to begin with this, but then the week beyond that third week of May, hopefully back up closer to normal where we should be. The other, I think the other sign here is that we've been drier than normal for at least parts of the state, especially the south and east part of the state. There will be more frequent chances for precipitation if this trend in the guidance pans out as forecast. We should see more frequent chances and probably heavy, and you can see that reflected here in the 8 to 14 day outlook with above normal precipitation forecast. So some moderation, it will not be, I guess, for those looking for a huge, and sometimes we see a major 180-degree change from abnormally cold to summer within a 48-hour period. There's nothing like that in the guidance at all. What the issue is ultimately probably some gradual moderation. That's what at least the guidance calls for right now. So again, an unusually cold week with frost, freezing temperatures basically almost on a daily basis in northern parts of the state through the middle of next week. That's, again, for May, even for the northern part of the state, that's incredibly unusual. Best chances for the southern part of the state will be here over the next 3 nights or so, with lesser chances as we move into next week. A dry week, most places less than 1/10 of an inch, and then, as we just talked about, maybe some moderation here about a week to 2 weeks out. And another reminder here, well, I'll wrap up there, but another reminder of our speaker next week, Dr. Aaron Burns. And in one of these days, we will be able to talk about post-emergence for many of our crops, hopefully not too far off here. But with that, I'll wrap up and finish up and see if anyone has any questions.
We've got several.
Okay.
So weather was popular. Is there a chance that we will have enough cloud cover on Saturday morning to keep the lowest temperatures from reaching the ground?
Good question, and I should have spent a little more time because, as I mentioned, this is not expected to be a classic radiation type freeze. And of course, what prevents that radiation conditions are either, well, clouds, which prevent the surface from cooling off as fast, and wind, and we will see some of both. So really, you're looking almost more like an advective type of freeze, which is in some cases worse, especially if it does get down in the mid-20s or less than that. But the answer to the question direct is yes. It should help prevent low temperatures getting lower than they might be otherwise, and that's why I mentioned those dew points. Sometimes it's a nice or it's a guide. How low could the air temperature actually fall if it were clear and calm? It's a little bit of it's not always right on the money, but it's a good idea. And if we see, again, dew point temperatures tomorrow afternoon in the upper teens, in low 20s, if we do find some spot areas that do clear off and the wind does calm down, and we may see that, that's where we'll see those lowest temperatures. So I would expect to see quite a bit of variability from place to place in terms of low temperatures here over the next several days. But fortunately, we aren't looking, I think, for most areas that we'll see really clear calm. That will be the worst spots.
There's a couple questions about chilling risk and with this cold front coming through. One, is there a risk? And two, should they stop planting after today until those temps come back up?
That's a that's a really important question, and I probably would defer to some of our agronomist colleagues here. But the soil temperatures are still relatively warm. I do not think it's going to be cold enough, long enough to see crusting. The northern part of the state, that might be an exception. There again, almost a nightly occurrence. But with seed in the ground, it should be okay. And in areas especially that have had more moisture, that's another factor that'll give you a couple inches milder, or a couple degrees, sorry, milder conditions with wet soils, wet landscape versus dry. Those are the ones that would tend to be the coldest. But the issues we have to worry about, I think, are primarily the crops that would be out of the ground, actively growing vegetatively. And most of Michigan, we just don't have much of that here yet. The fruit crops, of course, would be an exception to that, and there's real reason for concern there. But for most of our field crops, hopefully it shouldn't be an issue. And I would probably pass that question just over to hear other people's comments. The soils are definitely going to cool off over the next several days, and that's always an issue, of course, with planting. And you saw what they were, upper 40s and low 50s, at least over the last day or two. Today actually will be a fairly good day too for most of the state in terms of high temperatures, but it's downhill from here for the next several days, and that will continue likely through the middle of next week. So it's an extended period with unusually cool environment, and I think that's probably the most important thing to remember.
There was a question about if you have irrigation, how much protection could you get from applying half an inch over Thursday and Friday?
Sure, and that's a good question. You will get a couple degrees. You should get a couple degrees of benefit from having the water. The water acts to increase the thermal conductivity. That's the physics of it, and it sounds crazy, but you do lose a little bit of heat in terms of evaporation from the water. But the most important thing is as you add water to the soil and you fill up the pore spaces, you replace, of course, what's in the pore spaces, you replace air with water, and water is a much better conductor of heat than is air. And that's the physical rationale, and it goes both ways. So you're both adding more heat downward during the day when we actually, and assuming we have sunshine, we definitely will today, but you're adding more energy during the daytime, and then that energy comes back out towards the surface at night, and that's what the benefit is with the water. And it's also harder to freeze those surfaces when you do have water versus if they're dry. So you will see a couple degrees Fahrenheit difference typically. It can be different depending on the texture and the type of soil you have and how much residue possibly on the surface, but in general, the wet soils will be milder at night than will the dry soil.
Jeff, how much depression of soil temps on average would you expect for the overall event? If we were in the lower 50s for soil temperatures, it may be prudent to hold off.
Yeah, and it's certainly, for most areas, you're not going to get any kind of germination. It's just too cool for that. I'm going to guess that's an excellent question, and I'm anxious to actually see what does happen. But I'm going to guess at least 10 degrees that we lose in our soil temperature over the next week. I wouldn't be. Let's call it 5 to 10 to be maybe a little, but it's going to definitely make a difference, unfortunately. And we will see some clouds during the day. That's another factor that will help, will prevent any more energy getting in. So we will lose some of the warmth that we've had here over the last couple of weeks.
Jeff, I have a comment for you on the cold temperatures.
Yes.
I think alfalfa is really going to take it on the chin. We're going to see those plants that are probably 6 inches or greater tall that are going to freeze, and those plants are going to have to start over again, and it's going to cause some loss of yield and a reduction as far as a delayed in harvesting for a lot of these alfalfa growers. Not a good thing coming out of a real tough fall.
Definitely impact, as you said, probably the first cut will definitely be impacted. I guess it depends if it's burned back or it's, hopefully we don't take it back to the ground. But that's a good point.
So this is Dennis Pennington. I got a question for you, Jeff.
Sure.
We have the automated weather networks stations scattered across the state, so we can get an idea what the ambient air temperatures really fall to and for how long. Those temperatures are recorded at what, about a meter above the soil surface?
At 1.5 meters, so 5 feet above the soil surface.
Okay, so my question then is, do we have any data to know, like, all right, as you go closer to the soil surface, does that temperature increase, and if so, by how much? And I'm wondering, because with winter wheat, we've got our growing point now at the soil surface to as much as, like, say, 6 inches above the soil surface.
I'm happy to say we actually do, but it's we have two towers in the western part of the state, one at Sparta and the other up at Williamsburg, just to the east of Traverse City. They're used for frost protection for tree fruit, but we have air temperatures taken at 4 levels. We do have the 1.5 meters, so the 5 feet. We also have measurements up at 33 feet, and then one up the top at 66 feet. It's looking at inversions. But I'm happy to say, and I've always wanted to do this, but they've been there now for a couple of years. We also have one about 10 inches above the soil surface, and that's the one you want. And you can, so if you go to either Sparta Tower or Williamsburg Tower, those are the two EnviroWeather sites that have this ability, and you look at a meteogram, you will see all 4 of those air temperatures, and the pattern is very, very clear. The warmest temperatures occur right next to the ground. Of course, it's not surprising during the course of the day, but at night, not surprisingly, you get a flip-flop, and the temperatures aloft become the warmest, and the ones at the surface are the coldest. And it'll give you actually measurements of how much that is. Sometimes you can easily see 5 to 10 degrees difference between the near surface and then 60 feet above the surface. But it's done. They're 5-minute data. You can see with a lot of detail each day how that happens. So we do now, since those went in the spring of 2017. So we got a couple years. You can see I'll certainly be watching those over the weekend. But that's what I would suggest.
Okay.
Interesting series.
Okay. Yeah, and then what about the mixing of the air with wind? It looked like there was going to be some wind overnight, Friday night and Saturday morning, from what I saw, like 5 to 7 mile an hour winds or greater. How is that going to impact the temperature at closer to the soil surface?
That one is sort of a mixed blessing. Yes, it does keep the temperature a little bit milder than it would be because you stir up the lower part of the atmosphere because of the wind and because of the clouds. But on the not so good side is that it's a little bit like wind chill. You get more effective cooling of the plant tissue than you would if it were still. So the severity of the injury could be worse when you have the breeze. That's if the temperatures get, let's say, down to the mid-20s or less with a hard freeze. That's a bad situation, and with a little bit of wind, it'll be even worse. So it depends on how cold it actually does get. But in general, yes, with the wind and the clouds, that should help keep temperatures milder than they would be otherwise.
Okay, thank you very much.
No, sure.